Yeah, finally here, in terms of chapter content. This is going to be, like our other book studies. I'm going to, hit a few verses at a time. I mean, there's so much in Hebrews, I doubt if we'll ever really hit a whole chapter in one episode, but who knows, just wait and see till we get there. But same procedure. This is not going to be verse by verse commentary. I'm just going to land on things that I think I need to say something about, or things that are especially interesting. And so that's how we're going to begin. As far as the structure of the book, I should say something here real briefly. We're going to do the introduction, what scholars recognize as the introduction of the book today, the first 4 verses. And then you could actually break the book into 3 sections. The first section would be Christ's royal sonship. Again, the theme is the supremacy of Christ. So his supremacy as the elect royal son, as opposed to the other sons of God or anybody else. That's from chapter 1, verse 5, all the way into chapter 4, about verse 13. And then from that point on, it's really the superiority of Christ's high priesthood. That goes from chapter 4:14 all the way into chapter 10, around verse 18. Then the rest of the book is basically a series of exhortations to believers in light of what they've just talked about, the superiority of Christ. So the book is actually pretty simple to break down. We're not going to necessarily worry too much about structural things, but there are those who sort of like that information, so I thought I'd say something up front. But let's just jump into the section we're going to do today. I'm going to read all 4 verses, and then, like I said, we'll just drill down at different points. So again, I'm reading ESV, and we read here starting in verse 1. Long ago, at many times and in many ways, God spoke to our fathers by the prophets, but in these last days he has spoken to us by his Son, whom he appointed the heir of all things, through whom also he created the world. He is the radiance of the glory of God and the exact imprint of his nature, and he upholds the universe by the word of his power. After making purification for sins, he sat down at the right hand of the Majesty on high, having become as much superior to angels as the name he has inherited is more excellent than theirs. That's verses 1 through 4. There are going to be places where I'm going to suggest, doing something a little bit different with the translation, but generally there's nothing, terrible about the translation. We're not like in Deuteronomy 32 at verse 17 where the ESV just messes that up terribly. But it's pretty straightforward. There are a couple things just off the bat here. In verse 3, and I'm going to mention these quickly because I want to camp on other things, but in verse 3, this line that he upholds the universe, there's nothing special about the verb upholds. It's just a very common verb, pharaoh. BDAG, which is the standard lexicon for New Testament Greek, lists as one possible meaning, and I think this is the one that sort of captures the intent here, is pharaoh can mean to cause to continue in a state or condition. In other words, it's kind of a maintenance idea, a sustenance idea. Pharaoh typically means to carry or to pick up, in the sense of like a burden, you're carrying something heavy, that sort of thing. But here the author uses it, again, I think in this little bit more of an abstract sense, to continue in a state or condition. And so, again, that's what happens to the, quote, universe. Now, there is an issue here with the translation. There's no Greek word for universe, although you're going to see this translation if you're using ESV in a couple of other places where we have the term ion, like the age, okay, or it could be translated world. You're going to see that in the plural. And so when we hit those instances, we're going to talk about, does Hebrews affirm the plurality of worlds? Because that term is in the plural, but that term is not here. Literally, what this phrase says is that he upholds all things. For those of you who have a little Greek, this is the plural of pontos, okay? So we don't even have that ion word here. And you might say, well, why in the world would they opt for universe here? I don't think it's a bad translation. It's obviously not very literal. But he upholds, or sustains in their present state of condition all things. Well, all things, sort of a modern way of looking at all things, you could see how a universe might occur to a modern person. And so that's why I think the ESV translator used it here. But there is no, specific word to this. It's literally just all things. And when we run into those other instances where we talk about the plurality of worlds idea, we'll flag that when we get there. But that's not going to be in chapter 1. It's not going to be for a while, actually. So having just made a couple comments there are two adverbs here. I think I should say something about these, this many times and in many ways. One is palumeros, and that's the many times, at least in the ESV translation. The other one is palutropos. So palumeros and palutropos. The first one speaks of things done incrementally. Okay, so many times. Again, some sort of incremental dispensing of information, because it's God speaking at many times in many ways. So that it refers to, again, something that's just piecemeal. And this is probably, again, a reference to the Old Testament revelation. The Old Testament revelation came in sections or portions at various times. It's quite large. So it was never produced at the same time. And so hence this description. The other one is in many ways. All right? This would refer to the diverse forms and the variety of content, just maybe genres, maybe subject matter, that kind of thing that is the Old Testament. So it's not just one subject, not just one literary form, not just one anything. And so this is the reference to long ago, in this incremental way and in various modes of speaking, God spoke to our fathers by the prophets. Now you say, well, why? That's kind of straightforward. Why bring it up? Well, there are some who might want to take this language and create, drive some sort of wedge between the Old Testament and the New Testament, that, well, as time went on, later revelation corrected earlier revelation. Again, that is not; those are not ideas that you can divine from, just these normal Greek adverbs. I mean, it's obvious what they describe, but to read in anything like that would be unwarranted. I think Attridge and Kerster, their commentary on the Hebrews, epistle to the Hebrews in the Hermeneus series, puts this well. They write, God's speech through the prophets comprised commandments and exhortations, oracles and stories, and it came to its human recipients sometimes directly, sometimes in visions or dreams, sometimes in awesome theophanies, and at other times in a still small voice. However the multiplicity of God's speech of old is to be conceived, Hebrews' basic affirmation is that such diversity contrasts, here's the big point, such diversity contrasts with the singularity and finality of God's eschatological speech in the Son, that is, his Son, Jesus. Thus, while the initial adverbs are not necessarily pejorative, they seek here to contrast the two phases of the divine address to the disadvantage of the earlier. In other words, the revelation about Jesus is superior because Jesus is a superior revelation. Continuing with their quote, while there is a clear contrast between the old and the new, there is no sense that the two phases stand in contradiction to one another. That's the end of the quote. So I think that's well said. It highlights the fact that what the author of Hebrews is doing from the get-go, and if you've read the book of Hebrews, I think most listeners probably have, the big theme in the book is how the revelation in Christ and what Christ did and even who Christ is, all of that is superior to what has preceded. And I think this quote by Attridge and Kerster really does a nice job of saying, hey, look, from the very first sentence, this is implied. Okay, God gave us revelation before. It was fragmented. It was incremental. It was sort of all over the place. But, in these days, okay, now, in these last days, we'll talk about that phrase in a moment, he has spoken to us by his Son. And that's like, it's fully formed, it's final, it's superior. I should, just as a little bit of an editorial comment here, one thing I'd like the listeners to be thinking of as we go through Hebrews is this question. And I don't mean to be overly critical. I mean to be appropriately critical here. But you should be asking yourself, how in the world can anybody in the Hebrew roots movement read the book of Hebrews and like it? Because it is consistently making this claim of the superiority of Christ. How in the world is going back to the, by implication, and really by statement, inferior stuff? How does that assist us as believers? How does that even honor or take seriously the content of the book of Hebrews? So I'd like listeners just to be thinking about that as we go through the book. We're going to be here for a while, but in almost every place, that's an appropriate question. Now, going back to the passage, our fathers, again, is going to point, orient us back to the Israelites, again, to the Jews, the Hebrews. We don't lose the Gentiles from the get-go because the writer is going to be using the Septuagint a lot. So if you're a Gentile convert to following Christ, and you can read Greek, which basically everybody could, but you have access to the Septuagint, which might be a different question. But those who are literate and can do that and have access to it, they're going to be familiar with Old Testament content because that was the Bible of the early church. That's their Bible. That's what they're talking about on a weekly or even daily basis when they meet. That is the body of revelation. That is Scripture. It's the Old Testament. So Gentiles are not hopelessly ignorant of Old Testament content, especially since they have a translation in the Septuagint. So this phrase, our fathers, isn't like either to divorce what's going to be said from the Gentiles or is going to leave the Gentiles hopelessly confused. Neither of those things is going to be the case. Now down into verse 2, this phrase, in these last days, what does that mean? This is a book written in the New Testament period. Sometime in the first century, we talked about dating last time when we introduced the book, and scholars throw around the date of 60, roughly. That seems to be sort of the working number here. What do they mean in the last days? Well, you got really two options. It's a phrase that means either at the end of these days that we're like living in now, and for the immediate audience, that would be the end of the Christian period. Okay. The end of the first century, the end of the early Christian period. Or number two, it could mean at the end of the previous age. It could mark the end of the previous age, in other words. And so the dawn of a new era is something they're experiencing right then. And it's a positive thing. It's great to be at the dawn of a new era while this other one is passing away. And these last days, we get to witness the passing of the old era, and we're here at the cusp of the new. So you got two choices. Again, either this is an apocalyptic thought that, the world's going to end. Here we are as Christians, and things are just going to be no more imminently, and they're thinking of the end of their own time period, or they're thinking of the end of the previous time period, and then they're at the dawn of this new beginning. It's probably the latter, actually, due to the parallel expression. Similar phrase in Hebrews 9, verse 26, which reads, "For then he would have had to suffer repeatedly since the foundation of the world, but as it is, he has appeared once for all at the end of the ages to put away sin by the sacrifice himself." So it's the closest phrase, and it's pretty close to this one, end of the ages, last days. And most scholars would say, again, this is probably sort of a correlative or parallel reference here, which would indicate that they're thinking of the passing of the old and the dawn of the new. Now, that is not to say that he's writing to a bunch of people that would not see, would not be like with the early church, that the Lord's going to come back soon. It's not a denial of that. It's just that the particular phrase probably most viably refers to the passing of the old and the dawn of the new, the dawn of the era of Christ, that sort of thing, where with the church, we have this circumcision neutral thing. Even though we're writing to Hebrews, everybody's aware that Gentiles are in the mix. That's not news to anybody. Again, nobody's going to go, huh? By 60, or even if it's later, this is obvious. Again, that the Gentile inclusion, the whole goal, or not the whole goal, but one of the important goals of the Messianic work, the reclaiming of the nations has begun. And now the old order is passing away, the new order, the time of the Gentiles, that's what we're in. That's the new order. And of course, that they're thinking is going to have an end at some point too. Paul talks about that and associates it with the return of the Lord. But again, for those reasons, it's probably better to look at it that second way. Now, Hagner, again, I think has a nice little statement of this in his Encountering the Book of Hebrews. He writes, "A turning point in the ages has been reached. He has appeared once for all at the end of the ages." He quotes Hebrews 9:26 there. This means that the author, in agreement with all of early Christianity, believed that the present age was in some sense the beginning of the end of time. Okay, they're in a new era, which is going to have a terminus point, but the old is passing away. Now they're at this new dawn, the new time, which is going to have its own end. But we're in some sense, we're at the beginning of the end of time, a unique era in which God poured out gifts upon his people that were the anticipations of the age to come, the eschatological age. So again, I think that's well put. This phrase here, let's go back to the verse 2. In these last days, he has spoken to us by his Son, whom he appointed the heir of all things, through whom also he created the world. Now, if you've ever looked at the text in Greek, there's an interesting item here that I'm going to take a little bit of disagreement with commentators over. The Greek here has there's no definite article. When you get to his Son, okay, there's no definite article before the noun, and there's also no possessive pronoun. Literally, this reads, in these last days, he has spoken to us by a Son, whom he appointed the heir of all things, through whom also he created the world. Now, I think commentators kind of missed the boat here because they lack a divine counsel context. And to be blunt about it, most New Testament scholars do. And that's not, I'm not blaming them for anything, because if your field isn't Semitics, chances are you're not going to run into this. Your contact with the Old Testament is going to consist of the fact that the New Testament quotes the Old. You're not going to be going back and looking at the Old Testament in its own context, that sort of thing. So most New Testament commentators don't have any sort of frame of reference for divine counsel stuff, and I think that's a bit of a harm here. I'm going to give you two examples. Okay, so the commentators are writing about the fact that literally this has a son instead of the son or instead of his son, even though the ESV translates it his son. Okay, literally in Greek it's a son. So Guthrie says in his little commentary, his Tyndale commentary, when in the Greek text the writer says a son rather than his son, he does this to show the superior means used. He is certainly not saying that God has more than one son. He is implying that the finest of the prophets cannot stand comparison with the Son as a means of revelation. Well, I'm sorry, but there are sons of God in the Old Testament. I don't know how you could miss that, but there are. So I think while I'm going to agree with his conclusion, and frankly the rest of the book of Hebrews bears out the conclusion, the means to arguing it just is not very good. Attridge and Kerster here, again, same problem. I'll read what they say. The expression without a definite article does not imply that there are many sons whom God could have chosen as agents of revelation. That I would agree with. Back to them. Rather, the term emphasizes the exalted status of that final agent. Westcott usefully paraphrases, in one who is son. That's a little awkward. I don't know how useful that is, but they're calling it useful. That's how Westcott renders it, in one who is son. As the following chapters will indicate, the Son, seated at God's right hand, is superior to all of their agents through whom God's word has come, particularly to the angels. Now that's better than Guthrie, again, because I would agree that of all the other sons of God, the supernatural sons of God from the Old Testament, which is a term used for the angelic host, and they are sons because God created them. They are his quote-unquote offspring, all right? So they're there. So Guthrie's denial, like that this language doesn't exist, just isn't helpful. This is a little bit better, but the point, I think, could have been made a lot more forcefully because of the contrast with the angels. If you have a divine counsel view here, it just makes the contrast all the more pointed. So the point about the superiority of angels, or two angels, is of course important. But embracing, again, this Old Testament concept, this Old Testament reality that God does have other supernatural sons, the divine counsel, makes the contrast, even that more pronounced. Here's what I would propose. Let's read about it or think about it this way. In these last days, he has spoken to us by a Son, whom he appointed the heir of all things, through whom also he created the world. In other words, he has spoken to us by one particular Son, to the exclusion of all the others, pointing to the great superiority of that particular Son, by whom, incidentally, he created the world. So it highlights this one particular Son from all of the others. It accentuates him in opposition to all the others. So if you, again, come at this with a Semitic context, and hey, it's the book of Hebrews, and you know that God has other supernatural sons, it's still a profound thing to say that there's this one particular one. Okay, and we're going to get into, well, why that one? What makes that one different? And the first 4 verses here are going to tell us what makes that one different. So again, I think it's kind of useless for Guthrie to say, well, he doesn't have any other sons, when he very well does. And the singular here, the lack of the definite article, doesn't hurt anything. It doesn't hurt the status of Christ. In fact, I would say it accentuates it, because it creates a contrast, a definite contrast between him and all the other ones that could say, hey, we're sons of God too out here. You know, we were here before the foundation of the world. Big deal. You're not this one. You're not this one. So I think it actually, again, makes the contrast even more significant. Now, this agent of creation status is one thing, okay, that makes this particular son different from the others. So 1:3, again, we have that statement about through whom he created the world. That is the beginning of how the writer of Hebrews is going to focus on this one particular son and say there's something different about this one. And then when you get into verse 3 and verse 4, we're going to get a full description of what makes this one different. Okay, but before we get there, we need to talk about the inheritance language in 1:2. This, I'll just read it again. But in these last days, he has spoken to us by his Son, whom he appointed the heir of all things. Then down in verse 4, there's this reference to the name he has inherited. It's more excellent than the one that the angels have, all that. There's inheritance language here. Now, the inheritance language does not mean that there was some point in the past when the son, this particular son, wasn't around, or that another son, another council member, held that status, held his status. And it is a status. Okay, the inheritance language is about status, not a statement of ontology. It's not a statement that he didn't exist. Well, he had to be created, then he'd become the inheritor. Okay, that's reading into the language in a pretty dramatic way. And I would say quite an unnecessary way, but people have their agendas here. It's a status, not a statement of ontology. There's no obstacle in the text to affirming that one and only one divine Son was designated as the inheritor in the mind of God from eternity. This is implied, as we'll see when we hit firstborn, the term firstborn in verse 6, which would be in our next episode. So I just wanted to say that now, because we're going to focus on the inheritance language and how that, again, needs to be defined. And it is defined. It is fleshed out in the first 4 verses, but then we're going to hit it a little bit again when we hit verse 6, when we get the firstborn language. Now, the important questions to ask at this point when we're thinking about the inheritance issue is this. There's really 2 of them. 1, why is this particular son the inheritor? And 2, does inheritance mean the one giving the inheritance, that would be God, is passing on or passing away? In other words, is inheritance about a successor or a changing of the guard? Well, the second one, the answer to that is obviously no. God isn't going bye-bye. God isn't retiring. God isn't fading out of the picture. And he isn't being replaced, okay? It's not the idea of a son succeeding the father situation, because the father is always in the picture. And, you read through the New Testament at the end of the eschaton, he's still there, okay? The father is always in the picture. Consequently, we need to think differently than that about the inheritance language. I would say the inheritance language is best understood as sharing or co-possession. Sharing or co-possession. In other words, this particular son mutually shares in or mutually possesses certain things. So when we talk about this particular son being the inheritor, okay, inheriting, appointed heir of these things, it's not God saying, hey, you over there, I'm going to appoint you to inherit all this stuff when I leave. No, rather, it's God selecting one particular son, and we'll talk about why, to be the co-possessor, the co-sharer, really the co-regent, the co-ruler. Because what's shared? Well, there's 2 things that are actually mentioned in the first 4 verses that that get quote unquote inherited. And I'm suggesting shared. One is, quote, all things. That's verse 2. And the other one is the divine name, which is verse 4. So God isn't like, hey, I'm kind of through with like being the master of all things here. You take the job. I'm going to retire. That isn't it. Again, because the rest of the New Testament bears that out. And he's also not saying, hey, I'm kind of tired of being who I am. I have the special name, this Yahweh thing, the name that is my essence. Again, if you've read Unseen Realm, you know all about this. You know all about the name theology. So God isn't saying, I'm tired of being God, and you can do that now. Okay. It's not about a transition from one person to another, as though the one is, there's this succession thing going on. That is not the point. So the point can't be that, and therefore we need to understand the inheritance language in a different way. And I'm suggesting that it's really about they both God and this particular Son share or co-possess all things and the divine name. I think that's the point. Now that obviously would put this whole issue in a different light. And it begs the question, well, why? Why is this particular Son, different than all the others? Why is he deserving of this status? And that brings us to the third verse, because the writer's going to explain that. Now, he's already sort of gotten into it, this thing about he created the world, okay? The one who's appointed heir created the world, so there's a bit of an equation going on already. But when you get to verse 3, he just sort of, it's a smackdown. So in addition to being the agent of creation, verse 3 gives us 5 things about this particular Son. 5 notes. This particular Son is, 1, the radiance of the glory of God. 2, the exact representation of his being or his nature. We'll talk about that term in a moment. 3rd, the upholder, sustainer of all things by his, not God's, by his powerful word. Again, that's an echo of the creative word, Genesis 1. All right. 4, he's the one who provided purification for sins. That's a clear reference to Jesus. And 5, he is the occupant of the throne at the right hand of the majesty in heaven. Now, note carefully and note well, these are not the things inherited. They are the things that establish this particular Son as the one worthy of the inheritor status. And again, in my suggestion, the co-possession, co-sharer status. This is what characterizes the Son. And it's really what validates him as the one who has this status of inheritor. The text never has the Son inheriting that list of 5 things. They establish why this particular Son is the co-possessor of all things and why the name that is above all names is his. In a nutshell, again, these 5 things identify this particular Son with God, with Yahweh. But he is those things regardless of what, again, he's eligible to co-possess. He just is those things. But they make him, they validate God's selection, as it were, God's bestowal of this equal status to this one particular Son. So I'm going to go through all of them, but to be honest with you, I'm really only going to talk at length about the first 2. The first 3, or the next 3 are kind of ancillary and supportive, but the first 2 are the most important. So in the sake of time, we're going to camp there. The radiance of the glory of God. That's the first one, again in verse 3. Now the word radiance, if you've read Unseen Realm, you know what this term is. This is apogasma. It occurs only one time in the New Testament, right here. And to figure out what the writer of Hebrews meant, we have to look at his source for it. It actually only occurs one other place. Okay, this is a really rare term. The writer's quoting the Septuagint, the Greek translation of the Old Testament, but the Septuagint, of course, included other books that are outside the Hebrew Bible. Other books that many Jews and Christians today don't consider part of the canon, but which in ancient times some considered sacred, others just they didn't assign sacred status to it, but they were still well known. The phrase or the term here, apogasma, in Hebrews 1:3, comes from the wisdom of Solomon. It's the only other time it occurs. This is a rare term, so it's very clear where the writer of Hebrews is getting it. Again, it's only found one time in the Septuagint. Here it is. Wisdom of Solomon 7:26. It's a longer verse here. For wisdom is more mobile than any motion. Because of her pureness, she pervades and penetrates all things. For she is a breath of the power of God and a pure emanation of the glory of the Almighty. Therefore nothing defiled gains entrance into her. For she is a reflection. She is apogasma of eternal light, a spotless mirror of the working of God and an image of his goodness. That's Wisdom of Solomon 7:24 through 26. Verse 26 is the one that has the term in it. Now you say, well, wisdom, boy, okay, man, I've heard that before. Well, you've heard it if you've read Proverbs 8, and it's probably resonating with you if you read what was originally the original draft of what would become the unseen realm, the myth that is true. I had a whole section in that on Lady Wisdom in Proverbs, and we're going to get into that here. That didn't make it into unseen realm. We're saving that for something later. But if you go to my website, www.thedivinecounsel.com, there's a short paper, little essay on Jesus and Lady Wisdom in Proverbs 8 that you might want to read. But here we have a reference to wisdom, and the pronouns were feminine. She is a reflection. She is an apogasma, okay? And her, again, was a pronoun used in here. This book of the Apocrypha here, or the Deuterocanonical if you're Catholic here, the Wisdom of Solomon, draws on Proverbs 8. This is, an intertestamental Second Temple period piece of literature. It's drawing on Proverbs 8's portrayal of wisdom as a woman. All right. Sirach is another book that does this. Sirach 24, verses 1 through 3 and verse 22. I'll just read that here. Wisdom praises herself and tells of her glory in the midst of her people. In the assembly of the Most High, there's the divine counsel, she opens her mouth, and in the presence of his hosts, she tells of her glory. I came forth from the mouth of the Most High and covered the earth like a mist. All this is the book of the covenant of the Most High God, the law that Moses commanded us. We'll get back to that statement in a moment. Because Jews thought that wisdom was Torah and that this was personified Torah. They put Torah at the level of God, which puts Paul's problem, with the Judaizers in a whole new light. But again, we'll come back to that in a moment. Just say something real brief about it. Wisdom of Solomon, another passage. Wisdom of Solomon 9, verses 1, 4, 10, and 18. Again, just hitting the highlights here. Says, God of my ancestors and Lord of mercy, give me the wisdom that sits by your throne. Oh, wow. Wisdom is by the Lord's throne. Isn't that interesting? Send her forth from the holy heavens, and from the throne of your glory send her, that I may learn what is pleasing to you. And the people were taught what pleases you, and were saved by wisdom. Now, that's the end of the quotation. The Jewish writer of Wisdom of Solomon, again, gets this idea, and of course Sirach does too, from Proverbs 8. Wisdom as a woman in the book of Proverbs. And while the term most often refers to practical, insightful living, according to God's law in the book of Proverbs, the writer of Proverbs at times portrays wisdom as a woman. There's a reference to her voice, okay? Proverbs 1:20, you've got Proverbs 4:6, 7:4, chapter 9, verses 1 through 6. Wisdom is, portrayed as a feminine figure. Proverbs 8:1 describes wisdom speaking to God's people. Does not wisdom call out? Does not understanding raise her voice? But what is especially remarkable about wisdom in Proverbs 8 is Proverbs 8:22 through 30. She is described as God's co-creator, the agent of creation. Here's the passage. This is the NIV. The Lord brought me forth as the first of his works. Before his deeds of old, I was appointed from eternity. From the beginning, before the world began, before the mountains were settled in place, before the hills, I was given birth. I was there when he, God, set the heavens in place, when he marked out the horizon on the face of the deep. Then I was the craftsman at his side. That's the end of the NIV version. Now the wording here echoes Proverbs 3:19, where we read, "By wisdom the Lord laid the earth's foundations. By understanding he set the heavens in place." Jeremiah 10:12 says something similar. It is he who made the earth by his power, who established the world by his wisdom and by his understanding stretched out the heavens. But in Proverbs 8, this wisdom figure is personified. Now, again, you can go to the divinecounsel.com, read the full paper. But just in a nutshell here, why the feminine language? Well, it's because of grammatical gender, not biological gender, grammatical gender. In Hebrew, chokmah is grammatically feminine. It's a feminine noun. Hebrew, like Spanish, German, whatever, they assign grammatical gender to nouns to coordinate nouns with verbs so that you know what's the subject, what's the object, what's the indirect object. Okay, what person and number, if you have a group, who's doing the speaking? Is it collectively them, or they, or he, she, or it? This is all person, number, and gender in a language like Hebrew. And Greek does the same thing. It has nothing to do with biology. For instance, in German, das Mädchen, little girl, is grammatically neuter. Little girls are feminine, they're female, again, but it's grammatical gender, and it is, in many cases, arbitrary. It's a system of classification that languages use. That's what it is. It has nothing to do with biology. But how is this consistent, with the New Testament teaching about Jesus? Because Jesus is the co-creator in the New Testament. Here in Hebrews 1, he's the one through whom God created the world. But here you got, something in Proverbs 8 going, I was appointed, I was by God's side, when he's creating the world. What's up with that? How is this consistent with Jesus? Well, we need a little more backdrop to answer that question. And I'm taking this from, again, the not the old myth draft, but the thing on the Divine Counsel website. I'm just going to read you a few portions of this. Actually, a good bit of it, because, again, for a lot of listeners, this is going to be new, because this material is not in unseen realm, and they may not have come across it on the website. But what we're talking about here is how this, how this particular son in Hebrews 1 is distinguished. And he's the co-creator, he's the radiance of God's glory, he's the apogasma of God's glory. And wisdom in the Old Testament is credited with both those things, this agent of creation and apogasma. Old Testament, if you count, again, the Second Temple books in there. But even if you don't, hey, it's still part of Second Temple Judaism. So wisdom actually falls into both those categories. And so how is this consistent with Hebrews 1, where we're talking about the supremacy of the Son, the particular Son, who, of course, is going to be Jesus? How does this work? Well, let me just read a little bit to you. There are several instances in the New Testament where Jesus is identified in some way with wisdom. 1 Corinthians 1:24 is considered by some an explicit statement to the effect, since Paul refers to Jesus as, quote, the wisdom of God, unquote. That's 1 Corinthians 1:24. However, it is not completely clear that Paul meant to identify Jesus with the wisdom figure of Proverbs 8 in that statement, in light of his wording in verse 30, where Paul says, and because of him you are in Christ Jesus, who became to us wisdom from God, righteousness and sanctification, redemption. So some would say, you can't really say for sure if Paul was actually thinking of personified wisdom in Proverbs 8. And, that's legit. The wording here seems to imply, or seems to simply list wisdom among a number of other attributes and theological concepts. Very well, it could be that simple. Since it is also possible that Paul could have derived his notion of Jesus as co-creator, Colossians 1:16, 1 Corinthians 8:6, from other lines of thought, scholars are hesitant to affirm what scholars call a wisdom Christology too firmly with respect to Paul. Much more striking, though, is Luke 11, verses 49 through 51. This text refers to the wisdom of God in personified terms, the same thing that happens in Proverbs 8. Now, listen carefully to Luke 11, 49 through 51. And he, again, Jesus is the speaker, Jesus said, woe to you lawyers also, for you load people with burdens hard to bear, and you yourselves do not touch the burdens with one of your fingers. Woe to you, for you build the tombs of the prophets whom your fathers killed. So you are witnesses, and you consent to the deeds of your fathers, for they killed them, and you build their tombs. Now listen to verse 49. Therefore also the wisdom of God said, quote, I will send them prophets and apostles, some of whom they will kill and persecute, unquote. So that the blood of all the prophets shed from the foundation of the world may be charged against this generation, from the blood of Abel, to the blood of Zechariah, who perished between the altar and the sanctuary. Yes, I tell you, it will be required of this generation. That's the end of the passage, the end of Jesus' statement, his accusation. The passage is straightforward. In context, Jesus is the speaker. He's railing against the hypocrisy of his enemies. But in verse 49, Jesus suddenly interjects another speaker, the wisdom of God, who proceeds to say, in the first person, I sent you prophets and apostles. Now, scholars know this is not a direct quotation of any passage in the Old Testament about wisdom. Rather, it is apparently an allusion to the Wisdom of Solomon passage, Wisdom of Solomon 7:27. Where wisdom makes everything new, although she herself never changes. From generation to generation, she enters the souls of holy people and makes them God's friends and prophets, unquote. Now, regardless of the source, Jesus creates the impression that it was wisdom who sent the prophets and apostles, something we know from both the Old and New Testament that God the Father did. Jesus' statement, therefore, identifies wisdom and God the Father together. It sort of fuses them. It identifies them with each other. Now, as far as those passages where the Old and New Testament say that God the Father did this thing, sending prophets and apostles, you got Isaiah 6:8, Isaiah 10:6, Jeremiah 1:7, 1 Corinthians 1:28, and there are other ones. So that's really interesting. Now, is Jesus confused? Is the gospel writer careless? No, the wording is deliberate. But the amazing impact of the statement comes when one compares Luke 11:49 with the parallel passage of the incident in Matthew 23. Now, I'm going to read Matthew 23. Same scene. Jesus is the speaker, and Jesus said, "Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, for you build the tombs of the prophets and decorate the monuments of the righteous, saying, if we had lived in the days of our fathers, we would not have taken part with them in shedding the blood of the prophets. Thus you witness against yourselves that you are the sons of those who murdered the prophets. Fill up, then, the measure of your fathers. You serpents, you brood of vipers, how are you to escape being sentenced to hell?" And here's the verse. "Therefore, I send you prophets and wise men and scribes, some of whom you will kill and crucify." Now, you look at that, it's pretty startling. Whereas the Gospel of Luke had Jesus making wisdom the second speaker and speaking in the first person, wisdom sent. Wisdom says, "I sent you apostles and prophets." Matthew puts the words of wisdom, who was identified with God the Father in Luke, into Jesus' mouth. Okay, Luke and Matthew, again, through sort of a tag team effort, identify Jesus as co-creator, wisdom, and the one who sends the apostles and the prophets. I mean, you put the two things together and it's really startling. So what the point of all this for Hebrews 1:3 is that this particular Son is the apogasma of God, a description only found in one other place, used of wisdom, the breath of God, who is in the assembly of the Most High, who came forth from the mouth of the Most High. Jesus is identified as wisdom in Hebrews 1:3. And wisdom was eternal. Okay, this is the second reason why this particular Son is different than the others. He is the co-creator, the agent of creation, and he's also eternal. Well, how do you know he's eternal from all that, Mike? Why? Well, why does that speak of eternality? Because he's wisdom. He's the wisdom of God. There could not be a time when God lacked wisdom. Wisdom comes forth from God and was always there. Wisdom is an attribute of God. Again, it's this personified language. This is how, when the writers do this, when they personify wisdom, it's not that God's sitting there thinking, "Oh, I knew I was supposed to do something today. Oh yeah, oh no, wait a minute. No, I better create wisdom for wisdom now, so that I can remember what I was supposed to do, or that I can think a thought and decide to do something. Poof, there's wisdom. Oh, now I know what to do." You can't have a God that's described in such a fashion. He wouldn't be God. You can't have an ignorant God. That is not the God of the Bible. Wisdom, this attribute, is eternal. And so when the writers, again, the scriptural writers start talking about God's wisdom and casting God's wisdom as this other person, this hypostasis, we're going to get to that word in a moment as well. Casting wisdom as this other person, it's again a statement of this other person is like part of God and is eternal. You can't separate the one from the other, and you can't have a chronology. Otherwise, you'd have a dumb deity at some point. Again, you can't say these things and be consistent with what Scripture says in so many places. Now, the result of this is, again, there's no time when God lacked wisdom, and wisdom comes forth from God. Wisdom. God takes that card out of His hand, and says, "Okay, we're going to do this because I'm wise, and I always have been wise. Wisdom is eternal." And when the Son is identified with wisdom in Hebrews 1:3, that means the Son, this particular Son, is eternal. He's different. Why? Because all of the other sons of God are created beings. And again, you can read Unseen Realm for the passages, to that effect, where God creates, the other, parts of the heavenly host. Now, a side note here, again, some Jews of the period, I mentioned this earlier, and a few centuries before Jesus, equated Torah with wisdom. Again, Torah is also a feminine noun. Torah, that's grammatically feminine in Hebrew, and so the Torah makes one wise. This meant that to many Jews, the Torah was divine. The Torah was at the level of God. The Torah was eternal. Now, the writer of Hebrews, just think about how interesting this is. The writer of Hebrews, the writer knows these traditions. He's using this, this passage about wisdom. He knows the material. The writer of Hebrews has already suggested that the old revelation given to the fathers is lesser. That was just incremental. That was scattered around. That was this and that. But in these last days, God has spoken to us by His Son, by this particular Son, whom He appointed the heir of all things, through whom also He created the world. And that particular Son is the apogasma of the glory of God. And again, we're going to get to the next line, the exact imprint of His nature. It's not the Torah that's these things. The Torah is not the radiance of the glory of God. The Torah is not the exact imprint of His nature. The Torah is not the agent of creation. The Son is, this particular Son. So he's a Hebrew writing to the Hebrews, knowing that what he's writing is really going to torque some of them off because they view Torah at that level. Hebrews is about the superiority of Christ to the Torah, and frankly to the Old Testament in general. And so this opening statement laid down the gauntlet and was already setting up the writer's appeal to believers later on in the book to not return to Judaism, to not return, to the prior revelation. This is why I said earlier, I don't know how you can be in Hebrew roots and like the book of Hebrews. I just don't know how you can do that. Again, if this applies to somebody out there, you need to think about that. Next phrase, the exact representation of His being or His nature. Again, the exact imprint of His nature is how ESV renders it. Now, imprint there is the Greek word character, and we get our word character from it. That's not the really important one. It's the word translated nature. That is hypostasis. We get our word hypostasis from it. The citation of Hebrews 1:3, this is from BDAG, draws attention to the Greek word hypostasis, often translated as nature. The term refers to essence, actual being, and reality. Again, that's Bauer, Arndt, Griniak, Donker, and Bauer, BDAG as it's abbreviated. Again, think about that. This particular Son is the actual being or essence of God. This, again, along with the apogasma, along with the identification of wisdom, means He is co-eternal. And therefore, the inheritance language doesn't mean that there was a time when the Son, was sort of out of the picture. Okay? He's a co-sharer. He deserves this status because He is eternal. He is the exact imprint. He is the hypostasis. He is the essence of God Himself. Now, Hagner, again, has a nice little ditty here, little quotation. The meaning of, again, this phrase, the character and hypostasis, the meaning, however, is not far different from either the Pauline notion of Christ as the image of God, the express image, that most excellent image, as in 2 Corinthians 4:4, Colossians 1:15, or the Johannine assertion that to have seen the Son is to have seen the Father, John 14:9, John 1:18. The Son is the unique revelation, the unique revealing, the unique manifestation of God himself. Okay, he's not lesser than. He is God, and he is again this expression, this manifestation, this revelation of the Father. So the inheritance language, again, I would suggest, is really about sharing. It's about this fused identity, this co-possession of the rule of all things and the divine name. But there's even more to it than that, and some of which we'll only get to in the next episode. But just real quickly, through some of these other phrases, the upholder or sustainer of all things by his powerful word. I've already said this whole thing about this being an allusion, again, to the word of God that came forth and arranged things, brought order out of chaos. Again, this Genesis 1 idea. Hagner writes, the Son upholds or sustains the whole of the created order. The Greek present participle pharon, sustaining, points to the Son's present and ongoing activity in upholding all that exists. Notice again, this is not what's inherited. Okay, the Son, this particular Son, didn't inherit that power. He had it. It's what makes him worthy of the inheritor status. It's a statement, again, that points to eternality, because if he's the one who really does this, really sustains the creation, well, then, he would have had to have been there from the beginning. Again, it's just you concatenate these thoughts. So, in the first 5 of the phrases, again, these phrases, five things that were given, we encounter statements that require us to identify Jesus uniquely with God. That's Hagner again. The Son is put with God at the beginning and the end of time, as instrumental in creation and as the eventual heir of everything at the end of the age. He also functions in a divine capacity throughout all interim time as the one through whom an overruling providence makes possible all ongoing existence. Now, the remaining 2, the one who provided purification for sins, the occupant of the throne at the right hand of the majesty in heaven. We're going to hit both of those themes later in the book, because they're both going to be picked up again, the sacrifice for sins, and again, sitting at the right hand of God. So we're going to defer our discussion to when we hit those again. But again, just think about 1:4 again before we wrap up here. Having become as much superior to angels as the name he has inherited is more excellent than theirs. So again, to go back to verse 1, God revealed himself in the Old Testament in scattered ways, but now we have a final revelation of Christ. We have a final revelation. He has spoken to us by this particular Son, who he's going to share. He's the co-possessor, co-share of all things, through whom he created the world. The one who is, wisdom. Okay, wisdom there from the beginning, who is part of God. Okay, and therefore inseparable from God, and therefore co-eternal. He's the exact imprint, the hypostasis of God, his very essence. He upholds the universe by his power. Again, then we get the purification language, sitting down at the right hand of God. Then we get verse 4, which I just read. Having become as much superior to angels as the name he has inherited is more excellent than theirs. Now, having become, ginomai is the Greek, makes it sound as though he wasn't before, that he didn't have that superior status before. The lemma is often translated to be, it can mean to be or to become, and so this participle could just as easily be translated having been as much superior, so on and so forth. But become, I would say become is fine, not because he wasn't superior in the past, but because this particular Son was, for a time, a little lower than the angels. That's Hebrews 2:7. That's why become would be appropriate here. He surrendered that status. He surrendered a status he had at the beginning. It was incarnated, became a little lower than angels, and now he has become, again, superior. It's actually a reference to his return to his previously superior status, which he did not consider. Jesus didn't consider that a thing to be grasped, according to Philippians 2. He let it go. Again, to become humbled, to become a man. It's the incarnation. So I'm fine with a translation like become here if it's taken in context. Now, people are going to twist it and try to make Jesus a lesser status, or a created being or whatever. You just have to ignore context like Philippians 2. You just have to ignore that. But people do. What can you say? Another couple things here. We could go off into the grammar. There's just a lot more to say here. Because the grammarians discuss this a lot. You have a bunch of aorist participles here. in conjunction with an aorist main verb. The main verb is he sat down, and Wallace, for instance, says this. I'll just throw this one quote in. The aorist participle is normally, though by no means always, antecedent in time to the action of the main verb. But when the aorist participle is related to an aorist main verb, the participle will often be, but doesn't have to be, contemporaneous or simultaneous to the action of the main verb. So in Hebrews 1:4, the first participle, this is me talking now, must be understood as antecedent in time, purification for sins, again, preceded naturally the ascension to the right hand of God. Again, we're talking about this state of incarnation here. But the others could well be simultaneous. And so you could look at the passage this way, or read it this way. After making purification for sins, he sat down at the right hand of the Majesty on high, having become, because the incarnation was over, as much superior to the angels as the name he possessed, or the name that he had possessed. Okay, let me just read that over. As much superior to the angels as the name he possessed or that he had possessed is more excellent than their names, than the names of the other angels. Again, you have a number of grammatical things going on here. The verb is there. It isn't even in the text. It's supplied by English, but we can't rabbit trail on all these things. Now, this suggestion, though, suggests the superiority of this Son was a reality before he ever sat down on the throne. It's just that his superior status was surrendered. In other words, Jesus didn't become superior to the angels only after the cross, resurrection, and ascension. Hebrews 1:3-4 can rightly be translated and understood in a way that reflects his prior, original, eternal superiority. And then you have this becoming language because of the incarnation. And you say, well, is that cheating? No. It's not cheating because of what follows in Hebrews 1:5 and 6. Again, we're not going to go off into this. This is the next episode. But it says, for to which of the angels did God ever say, you are my son, today I have begotten you? Or again, I will be to him a father, he shall be to me a son. And again, when he brings the firstborn into the world, he says, let all God's angels worship him. Again, Hebrews 1:5 and 6 is going to establish the fact that Jesus had exalted status long before the cross. The phrasing there in verses 5 and 6 about begotten, here's a hint for next episode. People think that begotten, well, this whole thing about you're my son, today I've begotten you. That's like talking about, the origin point in terms of existence of the Son, of Jesus. Well, guess what, folks? That phrase is actually used 2 other times in the New Testament where it can't be chronological. And I'm just going to leave it there. Again, we'll save that for next time. But again, there's something else going on there. Now, again, as we wrap up here, our understanding of inheritance is the big deal here. It needs to be borne out by the context, of all these things we've really talked about. The context of Hebrews 2, what comes after is going to be a big deal. This whole notion of understanding inheritance as a handing off of the baton, and the one that hands off the baton fades out of the picture, and now we have a succession. That is not in view because God is always in the picture. You have to understand the inheritance language in a different way. And again, I'm suggesting co-possession, co-sharing. Why? Because the 2 entities sharing are identified with each other. They're both eternal. One is the essence of the other. Again, you have to take the meaning of the terminology and understand a little bit about the wisdom background, and then think about the implications for the links back to an attribute of God, again, cast as an entity or hypostasis that has to be eternal. All these things, factor into how we would understand the inheritance language. It's going to be, with the name, Jesus, think about it this way, just this last thought about the name. Jesus already had the most excellent name before the cross. And so before he ever sat down on the throne. How do we know that? We know that from John 17. Jesus already had the name. I've come to manifest your name. I thank you for the name given to me. And if you've heard me lecture before, basically what Jesus is saying there, isn't it great? Isn't it great that I got to become a man, and I'm here to reveal you, what you're like to them, because you have given me the name. I am you, and you have given me, again, this body so that I can be among them and show them who you are. If you have seen the Son, you have seen the Father. Again, the theology of John here is significant. And so you can't look at this statement about, the name he has inherited is more excellent than, he didn't have the name before because he inherited it. No. He had the name before he ever went to the cross, John 17. And there are other things going on too. Again, you can read Unseen Realm for that. But all of these things factor into the context. The real wrap-up statement here is what Hebrews 1:1 through 4 does, is it makes clear that there is only one Son eligible to possess, to co-possess all things, and to claim the name. There's only one of those. And when you get off into verse 5, as we'll do next time, and in the content of chapter 2, that one Son, of course, is going to be identified as, if anybody needed the word, it's going to be Jesus. And all of that revelation from the opening statement is superior to the Torah. It's superior to what has preceded. So next time we'll hit verses 5 through 14, finish up chapter 1, and it's going to really build off what we've talked about this time. But again, the superiority of Christ to Torah, to everything else, to Torah and to all the other sons of God, to anything else in heaven and earth, okay, is really the point of the first 4 verses, the introduction. That's just the introduction.
All right, back into chapter 1, wrapping up chapter 1 of Hebrews.
Yep, Hebrews 1, 5 through 14. Now, again, I'm going to, true confessions here. I'm going to basically camp on certain parts of the passage, and really the parts are going to be verses 5 through 9. I will say a little bit about verse 13 in sort of a little bonus section at the end, and then verse 14. There's this comment about angels being ministering spirits. I'm not going to say too much about that. We might pick up some angel talk when we get into chapter 2. In fact, I know we will, obviously. But for today, it's going to be 5 through 14, but really mostly 5 through 9 is where we're going to spend our time here. So again, if you're new to the format, this is what we do. We don't do verse by verse, exposition of everything. We do just sort of what's interesting, and again, what I think sort of needs some commentary for either apologetic reasons or exegetical reasons or theological reasons. That's how we do it. So let's jump in here to verse 5. Again, we'll just take it as it comes. I'm not going to read through the whole passage because we do have a good bit to cover here, as you can imagine. And I've already alluded to sort of this little bonus round at the end. But verse 5 says, "For to which of the angels did God ever say, 'You are my son, today I have begotten you'? Or again, 'I will be to him a father, and he shall be to me a son'?" Now, the last episode, the previous episode, if you have not listened to that, you really need to before you jump in here. But we made the point that one particular son was considered eligible for the status of co-ownership, co-possession, co-sharing of, quote, all things, and then the name the name of God, the special name that is above all names. And we talked about how the first 4 verses indicate the eternality of this Son that distinguishes the Son, this particular Son, from all other heavenly sons of God, all other members of the heavenly host, and frankly, all people, all things in heaven and earth. This particular Son is distinct, and those distinctions make him worthy of this status of being co-regent, co-possessor, co-sharer with God himself. And the writer is going to, after introducing those thoughts, that he associates the Son with wisdom, again, which is eternal, an eternal attribute of God cast as an independent person in the Old Testament. When he says he is the radiance of the glory of God, he is the apogasma, a very, very rare term, only occurs here in one other place in the Septuagint. So we know what's going on there with that. He's the exact imprint of his nature, the hypostasis. He is the essence, again, the intrinsic reality of the Father. Then, after going through all that, then he says, okay, well, as if I haven't made the point already, let's compare in other ways this particular Son to these other heavenly beings. For to which of the angels did God ever say, "You are my son, today I have begotten you"? Or again, "I will be to him a father, and he shall be to me a son"? Now, right away, we look at this as moderns, and we think Father, Son. Well, that's, okay, one's the Father, one's the Son. That means one produced the other, or one begat the other. And, we have this language of begotten. We tend to have certain things in our head when we see these terms that we read into the passage because, hey, that's who we are. We're modern. But again, there's just a lot more going to it because, frankly, God did say this to other angels if it means I'm your creator. So by definition, again, when you go back to the Old Testament has a heavenly host. Several places they're called sons of God. There are passages that talk about God creating, again, all the celestial beings, all things, in heaven and earth and all. God did say, you are the one I have begotten. So this isn't unique. So it just that much should alert us to the fact there's probably something else going on here besides creation and chronology. And there is. And there are a number of ways to establish that. Now, again, I'm going to break this down into essentially three things. There's Old Testament usage of the term firstborn. Okay, we've got in verse 6, and again, when he brings the firstborn into the world, he says, let all God's angels worship him. We'll consider verses 5 and 6 here in tandem. And then we're going to spend a little more time on verse 5. But again, we look at this and we think chronology, we think point of origin. And it's really not, again, something you can say because God says that to other members of the heavenly host. That's clear in Old Testament theology. So we have to ask, well, how is firstborn used in the Old Testament? Is it ever used anywhere else? Yeah, it is. We'll talk about that. Second, we have New Testament usage of the term firstborn. That's going to be something we need to think about. And then we've also got, I'm going to make a point about grammar in one respect, one of these passages. So, Old Testament. Let me just give you one instance here where firstborn is used. And you in your head, you tell me what's the problem for point of origin and chronology, okay? Because that's how, like, Jehovah's Witnesses would want to take this verse and use it to say, see, Jesus isn't eternal. He was created at one point, and he was the first thing God created. That's why he's unique and elevated, but he's still created, and blah, 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 blah. Okay. Exodus 4:22. This is Moses in front of Pharaoh, asking, or demanding, to Pharaoh to let the people go, because this is what God told him to demand. Then you shall say to Pharaoh, and God is instructing Moses what to say, then you shall say to Pharaoh, thus says the Lord, Israel is my firstborn son. Here's the question. Is that true? Well, of course it's true, Mike. Israel's the son of God, just like Adam. Okay? The firstborn son of God is not the one he produced from Abraham. It's not Isaac. It's not the nation. God's firstborn human creation is actually Adam. So but wait a minute, Mike, it says firstborn. Firstborn has to mean the first thing created. It has to be chronologically prior. No, actually it doesn't. And calling Israel my firstborn son, frankly, demonstrates that pretty clearly. Israel is not either individually with Isaac, the first child of Abraham and Sarah. It's neither individually nor collectively the first human beings God is responsible for. It just isn't. So that undermines significantly this whole chronological approach to this term, firstborn. Firstborn, again, try to fix this in your mind. Firstborn refers to a special status. It doesn't refer to chronological priority or original point of origin. Now, it can in other contexts, but here's the point. Don't get misled by either the Jehovah's Witnesses or somebody else. Don't get misled into thinking that the term necessarily is about chronology and initial original point of origin. It's not. It's not necessarily about those things. And if you look at Exodus 4:22, that just can't be in the picture. The meaning of this term actually transcends this chronological stuff. It refers to a specific status. That's what we need to fix in our minds. Let's go to the New Testament. Firstborn appears in Paul's epistles 3 times. And again, here they are. Colossians, we have this one in Hebrews. Okay, we don't know if Paul wrote Hebrews, and I would say he didn't. But in Paul, he uses this term 3 places. Colossians 1:15, where he talks about, well, I'll just read it to you. He's talking about Jesus, is the image of the invisible God, the firstborn of all creation. So there's the term. Then you've got Colossians 1:18. He is the head of the body, still talking about Jesus, the church. He is the beginning, the firstborn from the dead, that in everything he might be preeminent. And then thirdly, you have Romans 8:29. Read that one to you. For those whom he foreknew, he also predestined to be conformed to the image of his Son, in order that he might be the firstborn among many brothers. Firstborn among many brothers. Okay, well, look at the 3 references. You have the firstborn of creation, firstborn from the dead, firstborn among many brothers. Well, you could say, okay, how do we, you look at the first one, maybe that's chronologically, you're like, that means Jesus is the first thing God created, chronological priority. Then the firstborn from the dead, Jesus is the first one to be raised from the dead, even though you could debate that, but we'll just go with me. Just go with it now. He's the first one to be raised from the dead, and then firstborn among many brothers. Well, what does that really kind of mean? Firstborn among many brothers. Well, it can't mean that he's the first human that would be glorified, because you've got lots of other believers. In other words, but you're going to try to argue some chronological priority. Well, he's the first one that he's like the initiate. There we go. We got chronological priority now. Again, this is how people are going to think about these terms. Now, I like Hawthorne's little summary here. The English word firstborn is misleading, for it normally suggests someone who is born and therefore created. But this cannot be the significance of the term here. And he's talking about Colossians. It can't be the significance of the term in Colossians, since the immediately following words, verse 16. Okay, everybody, a Jehovah's Witness is going to show you the reference here to verse 15. Okay, but will they show you what follows in verse 16? Hawthorne says it can't be chronological, this creation, because of what follows in verse 16. These words provide a commentary on the title, emphasizing the point that he is the one by whom the whole creation came into being. There are no exceptions, for absolutely everything in creation has been made by him. Now, did you catch the point? Listen to the verse. This is Colossians 1:15. He is the image of the invisible God, the firstborn of all creation. Firstborn of all creation. Here's the question. Or let me just read the next verse. He is the image of the invisible God, the firstborn of all creation. For by him all things were created, in heaven and on earth, visible and invisible. Whether thrones or dominions or rulers or authorities, all things were created through him and for him. And he is before all things, and in him all things hold together. So on and so forth. Now here's the question. How can Jesus be the source of all creation and be created? Isn't he, as a created being, included in all creation? If he is, then he can't have been created. It implodes. The thought implodes on itself. Either the text means all creation, or it doesn't. That means all the rest of creation. That's not what the text says. It says he is the firstborn of all creation, and for by him all things were created, in heaven and earth, visible and it's all encompassing. It's everything. So how can you have? It's like having the creator created before there was creation. It implodes on itself. So again, typically people like the Jehovah's Witnesses will show you verse 15, but they won't show you verse 16 because you might think about it. It's either all creation or it's not. And if Jesus is part of that creation, he had to be around to produce all that creation. He couldn't be uncreated. It's just, this is, if you get him into a conversation, this is where you say, well, maybe he's an uncreated creator. Oh yeah, that helps. That solves, it does solve the problem, doesn't it? And if he's uncreated, then he's God. Again, the whole idea just implodes on itself. So again, firstborn, even in that passage, firstborn of all creation, it doesn't really work to establish a beginning point for Jesus. Like I said, firstborn from the dead, you could argue, well, what does that mean in resurrective sense? Again, there are obviously unique qualities about the resurrection of Christ, because in one passage in the Gospels, he takes up his own life, that sort of thing. There are unique things about that, so I don't want to minimize that. But the question is, can the term must the term firstborn, imply some chronological priority? Maybe it implies some qualitative priority, or some qualitative point of uniqueness, or some status uniqueness. Maybe that's the better way to say it. Now, third point, there's a grammatical issue here. If you go to Colossians 1, you have firstborn of all creation. If you had a reverse interlinear, Logos Bible software makes this easy because all the words are linked, by hand, to the original Greek and Hebrew. If you had a reverse interlinear and you clicked on the word of in firstborn of all creation, you would notice that, hey, there's no Greek word there for of. It's just supplied by the translator. What we have here, if you've taken a little Greek, this is going to be familiar. We have here two nouns next to each other, actually an adjective and a noun, and they're genitive. We have genitive. So we have, sort of a chain relationship. We've got a nominative noun, then a genitive adjective, and a genitive noun. We've got a genitive chain here. You say, well, thanks for the grammar lesson. That really helps. Well, it actually does help here, because what a genitive is it creates this X of Y relationship, the relationship of one noun to the other. Here we have firstborn and then creation. Those are the two nouns. What's the relationship between those two nouns? Well, if you put the word of in the middle, like English translators do, it makes it sound like the first noun, the firstborn, is produced by the second, or part of the second, which is, I think, a set produced, a set created, firstborn of creation. That's the way it sounds to our ear in English. Well, the problem is you actually don't have a word there, and so the relationship of the two nouns is open to interpretation. If you go to verse 18, firstborn from the dead, you don't have this ambiguity. You have a preposition, ek, firstborn from the dead. And if you go to the one in Romans, you have a preposition there. So this is the only one of the three that has this sort of ambiguous relationship, firstborn of all creation. Now, if you're interested in Greek grammar, I would recommend, again, if you've had at least 1 year, then you could handle something like, Wallace's second-year grammar. But he talks about the genitive at length, really, sort of, I don't want to say mind-numbing detail, because if you like languages, it's just awesome stuff. But it's very detailed, and he talks about the genitive relationships, and there's 15 or 20 different possible semantic relationships between two nouns when you have a genitive here. One of them is called the genitive of subordination, and I'm just going to read you what Wallace says here. The genitive substantive specifies that which is subordinated to or under the dominion of the head noun. Instead of the word of, supply the gloss over, or something like that, to get the feel for it, that it's going to suggest dominion or priority. So you could very well translate, and frankly, I would say this makes a whole lot of sense, and you should. You could very well translate firstborn of all creation as firstborn over all creation. Okay, that takes, again, the chronology out of it, and it again assigns a special status to firstborn. And that's legitimate. What I just did is legitimate because we don't have a preposition there. We have two nouns in a genitive relationship. Head noun is firstborn, genitive is creation. And this is what exegesis is. You have to determine these relationships according to the rules of grammar. And that is a distinct possibility, and I would say it makes a whole lot of sense. Because back to the problem, if you just look at verse 15, maybe there's a point of origin here. If you look at 16, well, if it's all creation, how could he be part of that creation and yet produce all creation? It doesn't make any sense. It implodes. So the general point being made here about the firstborn language, going back to to the whole, subject matter, of the passage here, verses 5 and 6, don't get tripped up again by this firstborn language. It is not inconsistent with what we read earlier in the first 4 verses, where this particular son is identified with God because he's identified with God's true essence, what he is in reality, and also his eternal attribute of wisdom. He's eternal. He's not created. And this firstborn language is not overturning that, because firstborn refers to a status. It does not of necessity refer to point of origin or chronological precedence, that kind of thing. So it can be kind of misleading. The whole point, again, of this language is to contrast this particular son with the angels. For to which of the angels did God ever say? Which of the angels did God ever say? This, that. This is what the writer is going to try to do. Contrast this person, this particular son of the first 4 verses, and then with all the other angels. And he says in verse 6, when he brings the firstborn into the world, when God, obviously, if you go back to the wisdom stuff we talked about last week, brings forth wisdom. Wisdom is the co-creator. Okay, well, very naturally, all the other angels are going to worship him because he is superior. He has this equality, this equal status. He is the hypostasis of the deity, of God himself. He is superior. So which of the other angels, the other sons of God, did God ever say this? Well, the answer, of course, is none. Now, let's go back just to this sort of, situation. When you get into verses 5 and 6, and you can probably tell, again, if you have a contemporary translation, you're going to have some of these statements. You are my son, today I have begotten you, and then I will be to him a father, he'll be to me a son, and let all the angels worship him. Okay, all that stuff you're going to have sort of indented or set off because these are quotations from the Old Testament. English Bibles have a stylistic way of indicating that. You have a string here of Old Testament quotations that are really kind of interesting. Now, the question, again, is rhetorical. For which of the angels did God ever say this to? Well, of course, the answer is none. There's a rhetorical factor here, but he's going to go into a bunch of these Old Testament passages and talk about how this particular son is superior, how this particular son is characterized in some way as qualitatively different, categorized in some way, and the Old Testament passages that he quotes, tend to support that. So in these 2 verses, we'll just take the first 2. You are my son, today I have begotten you. Or again, I will be to him a father, he shall be to me a son. Having declared in verse 4 that the exalted son, this one particular son, received a more excellent name than the angels. And again, you have these links to eternality. The writer identifies the name as my son. Okay, so before it was a son, we talked about that last time, one particular son. Now it's my son. So there's a bit of a title thing going on here because he's going to quote the second of these quotations. I will be to him a father, he shall be to me a son. He's going to quote 2 Samuel 7, the Davidic covenant. So there's a bit of a dynastic relationship, a particularizing of the son in this citation. Verses 5 and 6, though, together, he actually quotes 2 passages from the Old Testament, Psalm 2:7, and then the one I just mentioned, 2 Samuel 7:14. And both are familiar messianic texts. I mean, the first one about ruling the nations with a rod of iron and all that. And then you've got this whole Davidic covenant passage in 2 Samuel 7. So this is familiar messianic territory. Lane, in his Hebrews commentary, writes this. He says, there's a certain degree of unresolved tension in the writer's designation of Jesus as son, that since the title can be applied to the pre-existent son, we talked about that last week, verse 3 getting into verse 4. God can refer to Jesus as the son when he's the pre-existent son. He can refer to him as son when he's the incarnate son. Okay? Then Lane references verse 2 there. In these last days, he has spoken to us by his son. Again, that's a reference to Jesus coming as incarnate. And you can also, again, use the phrase proleptically or as a foreshadowing way to the exalted son. So what Lane is saying here is you can use this sonship language of Jesus in 3 different contexts: pre-existence, his existence as a man, and then his exaltation later on after the cross, after the resurrection and ascension. So continuing with Lane, he says it was apparently the writer's conviction that although Jesus was the pre-existent Son of God, and again, that should be pretty clear because of last week. Jesus was the pre-existent Son of God. Although that's the case, he entered into a new dimension in the experience of sonship by virtue of his incarnation, his death, and then his exaltation. So what he's saying here is that this sonship language applied to Jesus, and again, he's the particular son. It's, we need to think of sonship in different aspects, not just, again, creation and chronological priority. because the same language, can be used of Jesus at three different stages of who he was and who he is and will be. And you can still use the same language. So, Lane's just pointing out, we have to think about, the elasticity of the language and not just go, in one direction again, like those who want to see Jesus as a created being. Now, back to the two quotations, Psalm 2:7, 2 Samuel 14. I'll focus a little bit on Psalm 2 in a moment for some divine counsel implications. That's going to be our little tack on at the end, especially the Deuteronomy 32 worldview. There's something going on in Psalm 2 that if you're familiar with Deuteronomy 32 worldview, there's something there that's going to jump out at you, but we'll save that to the end. Here in this context, some take the first statement as indicating Jesus was a created being by virtue of the word begotten. For to which of the angels did God ever say, "You are my son, today I have begotten you"? Some take that as indicating Jesus was created, or that Jesus became the Son of God when adopted by God. Usually that's put at his baptism, when the voice of God from heaven says, "This is my beloved Son." Okay? So some people say it either means Jesus was created or that he was adopted by God. But a few things are conveniently forgotten by those who would take either this creation idea or the adoptionist view of Christology. Do we realize that Psalm 2:7, which says, again, it's a straight quotation, "You are my son, today I begotten you," is quoted in other passages in Hebrews, other passages besides Hebrews 1:5. Believe it or not, that psalm actually gets quoted in other places. And those contexts, those other places, defy a connection between the word begotten and either a creation moment or an adoption at Jesus' baptism. Now, let me try to illustrate what I mean here. Let's go to Acts 13:33. I'm going to go back up to verse 29. This is when Paul is explaining his ministry to Gentiles to the Jerusalem church. So this is Acts 13. It's at the beginning of Paul's ministry, and they want an explanation of what's this crazy guy doing preaching to Gentiles, okay? So you go to verse 29, and it says this: when they had carried out all that, Paul's talking about, again, the gospel here and what happened to Jesus. When they had carried out all that was written of him, they took him down from the tree and laid him in a tomb. But God raised him from the dead. And for many days he appeared to those who had come up with him from Galilee to Jerusalem, who are now his witnesses to the people. And we bring you the good news that what God promised to the fathers, this he has fulfilled to us, their children, by raising Jesus, as also it is written in the second psalm, quote, "You are my son, today I have begotten you," unquote. Paul continues, and as for the fact that he raised him from the dead, no more to return to corruption, he has spoken in this way, quotes another psalm, "I will give you the holy and sure blessings of David." Verse 35, therefore he says also in another psalm, "You will not let your Holy One see corruption." That's the end of the excerpt from Paul. Now, what do we have here? Did you notice that in that passage, the phrase, "Today I have begotten you," refers to the resurrection event. So it can't be talking about the creation of Jesus. It can't be talking about a creation of the second person of the Trinity or even the birth of Jesus. It has nothing to do with point of origin of a second person of a Trinity or another divine being or a point of origin of Jesus himself. Why? Because the phrase is specifically applied to the moment of resurrection, to the event of the resurrection. It's specifically connected to that event. The point, therefore, this phrase is not about chronology. It could be, now in theory, let's just wonder a little bit because this is going to come back up here. It could be connected to kingship because the resurrection is required for the ascension when Jesus ascends and sits down at the right hand of the Father. So there's probably a connection to kingship. This phrase, "You are my son, today I have begotten you," has nothing to do with his origin. Even if he says it to David, it's not talking about David's point of origin. It's not even talking about his selection, Jesus' selection to be king. Here in Acts 13, it's talking about the resurrection. again, this just defies the way, again, somebody like a Jehovah's Witness would use the phrase. Hey, let's look elsewhere in the Bible where the phrase is actually used. Here's another one. Now, this one's actually from the book of Hebrews itself. It's a little later in the book, Hebrews 5:5. We'll go back to verse 1. This is the Melchizedek passage. It says this: "For every high priest chosen from among men is appointed to act on behalf of men in relation to God, to offer gifts and sacrifices for sins. He can deal gently with the ignorant and the wayward, since he himself is beset with weakness. Because of this, he is obligated to offer sacrifice for his own sins, just as he does for those of the people." And he's talking about the high priest here of Israel. Verse 4, "And no one takes this honor for himself, but only when called by God, just as Aaron was. So also Christ did not exalt himself to be made a high priest, but was appointed by him who said to him," here we go, "You are my son. Today I have begotten you." Verse 6, "As he also says in another place, you are a priest forever, after the order of Melchizedek." In the days of his flesh, verse 7, Jesus offered up prayers and supplications with loud cries and tears to him who was able to save him from death, and he was heard because of his reverence. Although he was a son, he learned obedience through what he had suffered. And being made perfect, he became the source of eternal salvation to all who obey him, being designated by God a high priest after the order of Melchizedek. Okay, we'll leave Hebrews 5. Here, the phrase, "You are my son, today I have begotten you," isn't connected to any creation point. It isn't connected to any beginning point for a divine being or for Jesus himself. It's not even connected to the resurrection like it was in Acts 13. It's connected to Christ's appointment and his function as the great high priest after the order of Melchizedek, which itself is connected to being the sacrifice for sin. In other words, the phrase is connected with becoming the source of eternal salvation. It just has nothing to do with Jesus being a created being. Here it goes to the high priest, him being a sacrifice. Acts 13, it was the resurrection. It's kind of interesting if you just one little side note here. Back in Hebrews 5, Hebrews 5:8 says, "Although he was a son, he learned obedience through what he suffered." Jesus was already a son before the utterance of the phrase, "You are my son, today I have begotten you." Okay, the phrase is not about chronology. Okay, it's not about chronology. Jesus was already a son before we ever get to the point of him offering himself as a sacrifice for sins, like Hebrews 5, connects those two thoughts. And you have to look at these phrases in the ways that they're used elsewhere in the New Testament. And, in the Old Testament, you get the same phrase as well. You can't just pull one out. And again, this is what cultists do. This is what a Unitarian is going to do, or, whatever. This is how it's done. Okay, you lift out of one of these, and then you argue the point based on the one that you're focused on. The usage of the same phrase in other places, though, shows that your usage, that use, that tactical sort of utilization of the phrase to make one particular point is not legitimate. You've got to see how the New Testament writers understand these things. So I would say, based on these usages, again, there's this variety, anyone who'd connect the phrase, "Today I have begotten you," with the origin of Jesus, as though he was not pre-existent, is simply guilty of ignoring the scriptural use of the phrase. It's pretty much that simple. The same goes for adoptionist Christology. None of these uses are connected to the baptism of Jesus. Did you notice that? None of these uses are connected to the baptism. To argue adoptionism from the phrase, "You're my son, today I've begotten you," to argue adoptionism from that phrase, you'd need to argue that God adopted Jesus as his son at the cross or at the resurrection, because that's where the phrases are used. You'd have to argue that God adopted Jesus as his son at the cross or at the resurrection. But that's absurd. How do we know that? Because Jesus is referred to as the Son of God many times in the Gospels before either of those events. It just doesn't work. So you're either going to take the phrase in the context in which it's used, or you're not. Now, just because we make these points doesn't mean people aren't going to do it. They are going to do it. They're going to do it every day. You're going to see it on Facebook. You're going to see it, all over the place, all over the web. You're going to run into people at work or what, you get into a religious discussion, you find someone who rejects, the eternality, the preexistence, the deity of Christ. This is what you're going to get if they're taught. This is what you're going to get. But I would ask, next time you get it, ask, hey, that phrase, "You're my son, today I've begotten you," that we're talking about, where are the other two passages that it's used? I'll bet they don't know. So I'm going to offer a simple suggestion here in light of this. Again, we're just camping here on verse 5. Both of the places where it is used, again, associated with the high priest, appointment as the high priest after the order of Melchizedek, and then the resurrection, both of those are connected to kingship, if you really think about it. Ask yourself, when did Jesus become king? When did he, again, to quote the context of Hebrews 1:6, okay, and 1:5 and 6, specifically in this case, the whole, let's just go back to 1:3. When did he become king? When did he sit down at the right hand of majesty? That's 1:3. He did so after he offered himself as a sacrifice. He did so after he was raised from the dead. Jesus became king when he rose from the dead and ascended to the throne at the right hand of God. You say, so what? Acts 13:33, Hebrews 5:5 describes this chain of events. One of the passages is about offering himself as a sacrifice for sin. The other one's about the resurrection. Well, I'm going to suggest that the phrase, "You are my son, today I've begotten you," describes the inauguration of Jesus' kingship. It doesn't describe his creation. It doesn't describe his baptism. It doesn't describe his adoption. It describes the inauguration of his kingship. That's why it's associated with him offering himself as a sacrifice for sin, and it's why it's associated with the resurrection, because you need both of those things to happen before Jesus can ascend to the throne at the right hand of the majesty on high. Now, in that light, it just makes good sense to have the phrase occur here in Hebrews right after Hebrews 1:3. Hebrews 1:3 is about, ascending to the right hand of the majesty on high, okay? And so when we're thinking about, Jesus becoming king, then you throw in this phrase, today, or "You're my son, today I've begotten you." And then right after that, what does he quote? "I will be to him a father, he shall be to me a son." Where does that come from? 2 Samuel 7, the Davidic covenant, which is about kingship. It's very consistent. It's coherent. It's logical. Okay, all these things have a context. So again, I'd suggest that "You are my son, today I've begotten you" means, again, this is Mike's expanded paraphrase here, it means you have now taken rule of all things. With me, all things back there in verse 2, you have now taken rule. You're now the co-possessor. You've gone through the incarnation. You offered yourself. You rose from the dead. Now, come back home and sit here at my right hand. You are the rightful and only son who is eligible to co-possess and co-share all things with me and to have my name. You are now, you have now taken rule of all things with me, your father, and I'm not being displaced. God isn't going anywhere. It's not a succession plan. You have taken possession of your inheritance, rule over all things with me. And when you died, when you rose again and ascended to the throne, and now we will rule together as father and son. That's what the phrase means. Now look at what follows. Again, well, before we get to that, before we get into verse 8, I want to say this will be like a little, again, this isn't the bonus round at the end, but there's just one other little thing here that I can't let go. In verse 6, just real quickly, it says, "And again, when he brings the firstborn into the world, he says, 'Let all God's angels worship him.'" Do you know where that comes from? Okay, if you have the ESV and you look at the cross-reference there, it'll say, cited from Deuteronomy 32, verse 43. And in the ESV, it'll say in the Greek text. What else? Where else it comes from? It comes from the Dead Sea Scrolls. This is Deuteronomy 32:43, which, along with Deuteronomy 32:8, when the Most High divided the nations, he divided them up according to the number of the sons of God. These are the two places, 32:8, 32:43, where the Dead Sea Scrolls, has the demonstrable original text. What am I saying? I'm saying that the writer of Hebrews had access to that text. He quoted not just the Greek. The Greek follows the Dead Sea Scrolls here. That Greek actually expands a little bit on it. But the writer of Hebrews had access to that Deuteronomy 32 text that some people, when you try to talk to them about the Deuteronomy 32 worldview and divine counsel stuff, you say, oh, well, that's not what my Bible says at verse 8. Well, you know what? The writer of Hebrews didn't have your Bible. He had the correct text. He had Deuteronomy 32, again, according to the reading at Qumran. So this is a great verse, again, as well, to, again, I hate to be recommending stuff like this, but I can't resist. This is a great verse for King James only people, because they don't have this verse back in their Old Testament, Deuteronomy 32. So like he's quoting vapor, well, where did he get the quotation? Well, it's not back in your King James in Deuteronomy 32. I can tell you that, because the King James in the Old Testament was done using the Masoretic text, what they had at their disposal at the time. So again, if you're in sort of in a needling, cajoling mood, with a King James only person, you throw out Hebrews 1:6. But anyway, let's just move on. I don't want to spend too much time on stuff like that, but it is interesting. So again, the meaning of the phrase, to back up a little bit, I just couldn't resist throwing that in here. The meaning of the phrase, that you're my son, today I've begotten you, again, is that you have now taken rule of all things with me, your father, taken possession of your inheritance. You're going to rule over all things with me. We're going to rule as father and son. Now you look at what follows. Go down to verse 8. But of the Son, he says, your throne, O God, is forever and ever. The scepter of uprightness is the scepter of your kingdom. You have loved righteousness and hated wickedness. Therefore God, your God, has anointed you with all the gladness, with the oil of gladness beyond your companions. And verse 10, you, Lord, he's addressing the Son as God. He's addressing the Son as Lord. Okay, you, Lord, laid the foundation of the earth in the beginning, and the heavens are the work of your hands. They will perish, but you remain. They will all wear out like a garment. Like a robe, you will roll them up. Like a garment, they will be changed. But you are the same, and your years will have no end. I mean, why can he say these things? You know why he can say these things? Because of what we talked about last week. Because this particular Son has been identified as the wisdom of God, again, the attribute of God that must be eternal, because you can't have a dumb deity. You can't have a time when God is hopelessly ignorant, especially before creation, or it wouldn't have happened. Okay, he has identified this particular Son with God. He is the apogasma, again, the wisdom attribute, or the wisdom description. He's referred to the Son as the hypostasis of God himself, God's essence, what he is in reality. And if you do that, you can say stuff like this. You can look at the Son and say, your throne, O God, is forever and ever. You, Lord, laid the foundation of the earth. Well, of course, he was the agent of creation, because he's wisdom. Proverbs 8. You can say these things. Again, you have to have, again, the Old Testament context to pick some of these things out and to kind of make sense of what they're doing. There's just a lot here. And in verse 13, to which of the angels has he ever said, sit at my right hand until I make your enemies a footstool for your feet? And then he talks about angels. Are they not all ministering spirits? In other words, they have a lesser role. He never said to any of the angels, hey, sit here at my right hand. You're the co-possessor of all things. You're the co-ruler. Instead, the angels have a lesser role. They are ministering spirits sent out to serve for the sake of those who are to inherit salvation. Now, isn't that interesting? I don't want to get too far ahead. We're going to hit it in Hebrews 2. But think about this. You have the other sons of God. You got the other members of the heavenly host there. None of them qualify, because they're not God. None of them qualify for this special status of being the co-possessor, the co-ruler, all these things. They're assigned a lesser role. Who are they serving? Well, they're serving you and me. They're serving believers. What's the believer's destiny? The believer's destiny is to rule with Christ. They're actually serving us, who will, in the end, be exalted above them. That's what you got going here. And you're going to get a fuller description in Hebrews 2 of it. So not only, again, Hebrews 1, not only is this particular Son superior to all the angels, but you and I are going to have a status because of being united to that particular Son, where we are also, again, at this elevated level, this higher level. So again, just think about that. Again, we'll get into it more in Hebrews 2. If you've read Unseen Realm, you probably remember that chapter. But that's kind of an amazing theological statement to make there. I want to add another thought here. Just going back, there's just a lot of things that pop into my head when it comes to, again, this phrase, you are my son, today I've begotten you. Now, if we're going to go down this we're going to follow this trajectory, that I've suggested here. If this phrase is really about inheriting the throne of the kingdom, taking possession of what belonged to God, and again, this particular son, this is his rightful status. If that's really the case, and that situation could only be enacted or realized after making himself a sacrifice for sin, rising again, ascending to the Father again, because that's where this phrase is used. Acts 13, Hebrews 5. If that's the case, I would suggest that kind of brings Philippians 2 into a sharper focus. You have the one who was the name, who was God, is given the name above all names after humbling himself in the incarnation. Just think of Philippians 2, this whole, let this mind be in you that was also in Christ Jesus and all that. You have him humbling himself in the incarnation, dying on the cross, rising again to take possession of the throne that belonged to him. So God the Son becomes a man. Then he resumes his role as God the Son in his resurrected human body, in his resurrected body. Again, that's just how the resurrection works. At no time did the Son lose the throne. At no time did he lose the name that he had before the foundation of the world. Rather, he surrendered the throne and acquiesced to the limitations of the incarnation. Both of those were necessities to be the sacrifice for sin. And, I'll add just a little bit rabbit trail here. It was also necessary to fulfill the covenants. Again, you probably heard me say that before, but these things are necessary. The surrendering of all this was necessary to be the sacrifice for sin. And that, again, is key to redemption. Then you have the resurrection, the ascension. The whole thing is a working system. So these verses in Hebrews 1, this comparison, again, is not just sort of, idle theological talk. And I especially like, again, the connection to that last verse about the angels being ministering spirits sent out to serve for the sake of those who are to inherit salvation. I mean, that isn't all we're inheriting. If you really, again, know the backdrop of the whole, the whole counsel idea. But we're going to get into that more in chapter 2. Now, as far as this little bonus thing I've hinted at a couple times, let's go back to Psalm 2. For those of you who've read Unseen Realm, you're familiar again with the divine counsel worldview. If you take that, that worldview that derives from Deuteronomy 32, and you read Psalm 2 in light of that, and of course also in light of Psalm 82, which draws on Deuteronomy 32. The Psalm, there's things in the Psalm that really jump out. So starting with verse 2 in Psalm 2. Just listen to what it says. I'm going to read a bunch of verses here. Why do the nations rage and the peoples plot in vain? The kings of the earth set themselves, and the rulers take counsel together against the Lord and against his anointed, saying, let us burst their bonds apart and cast away their cords from us. Let's just stop there. The nations. Okay. Who are the nations under dominion of? Well, the sons of God from Deuteronomy 32. They're enslaved by the sons of God, Psalm 82. The kings, the rulers of the earth, set themselves, and the rulers take counsel together. Well, are we talking about earthly rulers or supernatural rulers? Well, ultimately in the Psalm, you're actually talking about both. But typically, you only get a focus on the human ones. If you include the supernatural ones in here, look at the next verse. They take counsel against the Lord and his anointed. Okay, God, Yahweh, and his son, this particular son that we're talking about in Hebrews, and they say, let's burst their bonds apart and cast away their cords from us. We got to get out from under those guys. It's this statement that they want their autonomy. They know they themselves are under dominion. They're under power. They're under a greater power. You look at verse 4 again in Psalm 2. He who sits in the heavens laughs. The Lord holds them in derision. Then he will speak to them in his wrath and terrify them in his fury, saying, as for me, I have set my king on Zion, my holy hill. I will tell of the decree. The Lord said to me, you are my son. Today I have begotten you. Again, there's the phrase. Again, if it's associated with, what was it? Offering of himself as a sacrifice for sins, that's Hebrews 5. Acts 13 is the resurrection. Okay, God's response to this is to laugh, first of all, and basically say, you're not getting out from under, my authority at all. And in fact, here's my response. I've set my king on Zion, my holy hill. You are my son. Today I've begotten you. In other words, they're not going to know what that means. We know what it means in hindsight because of books like Hebrews and books like Acts, that kind of, we know what it means in hindsight, but basically it's sort of a cryptic way of saying, you have no idea what's going to hit you. Instead of, again, this release you want, this autonomy you want, you have no idea how you're going to be judged, both the degree and how it's going to work. So it's really, again, if you just read this without the New Testament, again, it's very like earthly oriented. It just seems to be just a bunch of random thoughts. But if you read it in hindsight, there's a lot here, again, that really gets into this whole worldview. Verse 8, ask of me and I will make the nations your heritage. Christ is going to own the nations, and we're going to own the nations with him. Why? Because, again, of this grafting in. We are the reconstitution of the council. We're going to displace them. You shall break them instead of them breaking the bonds over them held by the greater authority. You, again, this one who the king that's set on Zion. Okay, the Son, today I've begotten you. The one that, again, the whole phrase refers to the inauguration of kingship, the idea of kingship. You, the king, shall break them with a rod of iron and dash them in pieces like a potter's vessel. Again, and where, again, is that phrase or the similar phrasing used in the New Testament? It's Revelation 2, verse 26. The one who conquers and keeps my works until the end, to him, this is Jesus quoting a messianic psalm of you and me. The one who conquers and who keeps my works until the end, to him I will give authority over the nations, and he will rule them with a rod of iron, as when the earthen pots are broken in pieces. Even as I myself have received authority from my Father, and I will give him the morning star. And morning star being a reference. If you've read Unseen Realm, you know this stuff, but a reference to messianic authority. I mean, just look at what's going on here and read the psalm in light of the fuller picture. And it just, almost every verse, just has something really, really neat in it. Verse 10, now therefore, O kings, be wise, be warned, O rulers of the earth. Serve the Lord with fear. Let's see some change here. It's a little bit of a sort of a plea, but on one hand, it's kind of an empty plea because of Psalm 82. They're not going to change. Serve the Lord with fear, rejoice with trembling. I mean, he doesn't extend an offer of redemption to them, but it's almost like, what's coming, so don't make it any worse. Kiss the Son, lest he be angry and you perish in the way, for his wrath is quickly kindled. Blessed are all who take refuge in him. That again, you got this mixture of earthly rulers and heavenly rulers, heavenly figures, and so on and so forth. But their fate is sealed, even though you have this verse 10 and verse 11. Hey, serve the Lord with fear and trembling. Their fate is sealed though because of verses 7 and 8. And verse 6, because there is going to be a Messiah, and he is going to be the Son. Today I've begotten you, and that is going to mean offering himself as a sacrifice for sin, and that is going to mean the resurrection, all these things we've talked about. So it's just a really, really interesting psalm. Now, I want to just, as a way of wrapping this up in one more point, in Old Testament theology, this is what we're familiar with, again, if you've read Unseen Realm. In Old Testament theology, the nations are ruled by earthly kings, of course, referred to as rulers, and they're also ruled by divine rulers, again, the sons of God to whom the nations were allotted and vice versa. Hence, the kings here could refer to either or both human or divine rulers. The psalm is about more than the son of David seeking or seeing earthly kings under his authority, earthly kings under his footstool. It's also about the gods of the nations being subdued by the son of David, the Messiah, and broken under his reign. There's actually a similar situation to this in Ugaritic texts outside of the Old Testament. Now, I'm going to put this article in the folder for newsletter subscribers. It's a short article. It's by Lowell Handy. It's called A Solution for Many Malachim, MLKM. It's from an annual journal called Ugarit Forschungen, 1988. And you have the same thing happening in Ugaritic text. You have in the divine realm, you have more than one king, more than one MLK, more than one Melech. And Handy's article does a nice job of showing that all of different members of the divine council were called rulers. You have multiple rulers under the authority of in Canaanite religion, the high god El. And again, they have geographical responsibility and stuff like this. So it's just this terminology, how it doesn't just refer to earthly authorities, but it also refers to supernatural authorities. And the same term is used for both, and in both situations. Again, the article goes into the fact that even in earthly administrations, earthly bureaucracies, you could have more than one person referred to by MLK, by king. It just means ruler, somebody who has authority. Now, ultimately, there's a hierarchy, there's a highest authority and all that, but it's just a really interesting article that shows, again, in the wider Semitic world, the wider Canaanite world, this concept, again, about there being, Yahweh, the Most High, and then underneath him, you have these other rulers of the earth that are allotted to the nations, of course, and they ultimately go corrupt. They want their autonomy, but as Psalm 2 says, you ain't getting that. Instead, you're going to get judgment. That whole way of thinking, again, is not it's not contrived. It's something that someone in ancient Israel, an ancient Canaanite, would have been quite familiar with. It would have been just part of their worldview. But again, we miss that because we're modern. We just don't have that stuff in the can, so to speak. We don't have it floating around in our heads. So that's our little bonus. Again, some divine counsel stuff there, and I even threw in Hebrews 1:6 about Deuteronomy 32:43. But let's not miss the fuller point. This language, just to wrap up here, this language about today, you're my son, today I've begotten you, has nothing to do with point of origin or chronology. This is a statement about inheriting the throne of God, and the only one eligible for that is the one who, again, is eternal. He is wisdom. He is the essence of God, and none of the other angels are. And so, again, a lot of what we talk about, again, in divine counsel stuff, unseen realm, it really sort of comes to a head here. You can really see it jump out in Hebrews 1, the difference between this particular son and all the other ones. And it's going to get even more dramatic when we drift into chapter 2. We've already gotten a whiff of it here, that the ministering spirits, those who are given a lesser role, the ones who the son, the particular son, is being compared to, those ministering spirits who have a lesser role are actually assigned to help, again, to serve human believers who will, in the end, have a superior position to them. Again, back to Paul's 1 Corinthians 6:3. Don't you know that you're going to judge angels? Don't you know that you're going to rule over angels? So you get a glimpse of it here in Hebrews 1.
And we wonder why some of them didn't like it and rebelled.
Yeah. Yes, that's such a mystery.
I mean, really.
But there's so much irony in verse 14. All those other guys we've been talking about that aren't at the level of this one. Oh, we know what they do. They serve you guys, and then the next chapter it's like, hey, you guys are going to end up over them. It's just full of irony.
And I don't know how a layman or just anybody reading through Hebrews is going to take away anything other than begotten you from.
Yeah, the real key is looking up the phrase where else it occurs and noticing that it can't have anything to do with creation origin.
And I'm going to bet 99% of people do not do that.
Oh, I would imagine that's going to be on target.
Hence the reason why you need to listen to the Naked Bible podcast.
There you go. That's a good mini infomercial there.